The 13th, 1984, Berenice Jackson interviewing Pascal O. Hibbs, known as Pac.
Better known as Pac.
I'm going to call you Pac from now on.
Fine, that's good.
When were you born?
February 17th, 1912.
At
Elwood, Oklahoma.
At Elwood, Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
Now we are going to go back in order to get the early day history, because this is the only way we can get it, is asking people like yourself about your parents and your grandparents and their life out here in the early days. Let's start with your grandparents. What were their names?
My great-grandfather and grandmother came to this country in April of 1887 and landed or took up homestead on the place I was born on near Elwood. Be about 1.5 miles north of the present Elwood post office. They had 3 boys and 1 girl. None of them were married at the time they came here. The eldest one was my grandfather, Ed Hibbs, who later became sheriff of this country when this was all one strip, which was then known as No Man's Land. He served this county, or Cimarron Territory, by horseback, he and 3 other men as his deputies. He told me several stories that happened back in those days.
Okay, can you tell them to me?
One of them that I recall very vividly, their courthouse was down here on the street. The only telephone lines they had in here was the wire was hung up on cottonwood limbs and cottonwood trees up and down the river from Woodward, Oklahoma, to Beaver, which was the capital, so to speak, of the Cimarron Territory. He got a phone call, as he told me, as I remember it.
Yes.
He got this call one afternoon that there was a fellow riding a gray horse and was well equipped with artillery, headed west towards New Mexico, and thought he should be entering this county about the time that he got the call. He went by and told my grandmother that he had to go. He had a group of saddle horses that he kept here in town all the time. He went and saddled up a horse, started up the river, rode the hills, because he figured this old boy would be in the bottom. And as he rode west, he knew all the ranchers from here to New Mexico. Said, "Did you see a certain fellow or a certain horse and a rider?" "Yes, he was here last night. Slept in that haystack there. We gave him his supper, told him to stay and we'd have breakfast in the morning." Got up the next morning, he was gone. So that continued on. And he would borrow a horse from that rancher, leave his horse there, get a fresh horse that way, so he outrode the old boy. And as he was nearing Kenton, Oklahoma, which was close to the New Mexico line, he seen this fellow. But in the meantime, he had changed horses several times. Left the horse, picked up a horse. And as he was rounding a big bend in the mountains out there, on the edge of the mountains, he seen this fellow right across. He stepped off his horse and had his 30-30, squatted down on his knee, and hollered, "Halt." The old boy kicked the spurs in his horse, and he shot the horse right through the heart. Just missed the old boy's knee by inches. And dropped his horse right there and on the spot. So, which I will say, my grandfather was a marksman. He was a very good shot.
Yes, I can see
and
that.
So he rode around, and the old boy was leaning over his horse crying like a baby. He said, "It'd been fine if you'd have killed me," but he said, "You killed the best horse I ever owned." So they unsaddled the horse, put the saddle on his horse, on top of his saddle, put cuffs on him, tied him to his horse, and he started leading him and coming back. We get back to the ranch where he left his last horse, left that horse, picked up 2 horses. The one he left, borrowed another one. There was no fences in those days, so as he'd get to the next ranch, he'd turn those horses loose and they'd go back home, pick up the horse he'd left and so forth, till they finally made it all the way back into Beaver. They had a trial, and this fellow was sentenced to 2 years in the penitentiary. So he kept complaining about his horse being shot. He said, "I'll tell you, fella," said, "when you get out, if you come and tell me you've straightened up and you're going to live a Christian life," he said, "I'll give you a pick of my remuda," which is a group of horses.
What had the man done?
He had stolen some horses, bank, I don't know what all, but anyway, he had a record.
Yeah.
2 years later, now the saddle, his saddle, bridle, the whole thing was left in the courthouse, in the sheriff's office here. He said about such a day as he got his first call, this fellow came in the office and he said, "Mr. Hibbs," he said, "do you know me?" He said, "Well, I know your face, but I couldn't put a name on you." He said, "Did you ever shoot a horse out from under a man?" He said, "I sure did." He said, "Do you know what you told that fellow?" He said, "I sure do." Well, he said, "I'm that fellow, and I have credentials. I've studied for the ministry while I was in the penitentiary, and I give you my word, I've straightened up. I'm ready to claim my horse and go on my way." He said, "Your saddle and all is hanging right exactly where you and I put it when I brought you in. Get it, and we'll go to the corral." So he went to the corral. In those days, all they had for a corral was poles tied up to the posts. He said he stood up on one of those poles and looked the bunch over. He said he undone that rope and swung it around a time or two, and he said I could tell right then that that old boy knew what he was doing with the rope. So he said that rope went over the best horse I ever owned in my life. And he said, "Brother, I'll tell you one thing, you know how to pick 'em." He said, "Now, if this isn't all right, tell me which one you want." He said, "I told you could have your pick. If that's the one you want, that's it." Put a saddle on him, rode him around there a little bit, come over and shook hands with my grandfather. He said, "Well, I've met one honest lawman." And he said, "If nothing else, this would help keep me go straight." He said, "I'd like to be just like you." And he rode off, and that was the last I ever heard of him. That's one of the many stories he told me of the evenings while we're sitting around the fire at home.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a wonderful story.
So, but there's many more.
Yes.
And I won't take the time now.
You told me 2 or 3 stories. Can you tell me another one? Unusual? One more?
Well, I'll tell you one more that he told me that I remember. I don't remember the gang at the moment, but about such an instance, and there was 3 or 4 fellas, and they were horse thieves. And the Sharps Creek, what we called Sharps Creek, and was called then Sharps Creek, right south of Turpin, Oklahoma, about 4 or 5 miles. There was a spring there in a lake. It wasn't man-made; it was a natural lake that fed that little lake, and it was about stirrup deep to a horse. Good clear water. So they had got on the hills, he and his deputies, and they seen these fellows coming, and they knew where they was headed, so they outrode them and stashed their horses back quite a little ways and went off down their foot and hid behind the rocks. These fellows rode in and stirrup deep now in water. Said, "Well, we've got it made. We've got by that Hibbs at Beaver now. We've got it made."
They didn't know Hibbs was out there listening to them.
So he just raised up with his 30-30, and all of them raised up. Said, "Well, boys, get them high. I've got you covered." And this is that Hibbs from Beaver. And if you don't believe it, I'll drop you right where you sat. So that went their hands. He had one of the boys go out, take their guns off of them, and they waded out there, water waist deep, brought them back. That's one of the many things that he's told me. I can't remember them all, of course, offhand.
Were there any gangs, outlaw gangs
There
that came in?
several gangs. I don't recall their names.
Yes.
There was one of Jim Herring.
Yes.
You've heard of him?
Yes,
There's
I've
a book about Jim Herring.
Yes, I've got that book.
He was sheriff here when Jim Herring came down from Meade, was in this trouble. He had no hold on Jim Herring in this area. They had it in Kansas, but not here.
Yes.
So he loaned Jim Herring the horse that he left Beaver County. And he went to New Mexico or out there somewhere and got married later, you know, as the book goes.
Yes, I know.
I don't recall it all, but there was he's a very notorious man, Jim Herring, and a good man. He got in trouble, but then, you know, a lot of people get in trouble. But still good people.
Yes.
My great-grandfather and grandmother, getting back to the time they came here, they came from eastern Kansas. I don't recall the name of the place. They had come from Illinois. They had migrated from Illinois into eastern Kansas. They came on down here in a covered wagon with 3 boys and their daughter.
Did they tell any stories or anything that
On the
happened?
way? Yes, I'll tell you one.
Okay.
Then when they landed out here on Clear Creek, which would be about a mile west and a quarter south of the present Elwood Schoolhouse, which is 2 miles north of Elwood. And as they were crossing the creek, he had a brother, which would have been my great-grandfather's brother. And he was a mute. He had measles when he was a baby, and he could say a few words, but he couldn't hear. So then they had no way for medication in those days.
That's right.
He was sitting on a spring seat on the wagon, and as they crossed the creek, the wheel of the wagon went down in a hole and come back out, and when it did, the spring seat throwed him out. He landed on his head and broke his neck. So they took him up on that highest hill where the Elwood is right now and buried him on that hill. So that's one of the things. Then they walked around out on the flats out there. They found a spring, and that's where they set up camp. And very shortly thereafter, he bought what they call a relinquishment.
Yes.
And moved down on the creek, which is a mile and a quarter north, mile and a half north of present Elwood. And that's where they made their home. That's where they proved up the place. They were there long before they proved it up for settlements, you know. That wasn't until 1890, I think, when they surveyed this country.
Yes.
But they came here in 1887, so that was 3 years prior to that. But he did buy a relinquishment from these people and got their holdings. And that is the place where I was born. And
I always thought you were west and south of Elwood.
no, right straight south
idea.
of Beaver. And my father was born a half mile west of where I was, on a place that belonged to my grandfather, right on the creek. You might say on about the same creek bank, you know. It was the same creek.
Yes.
And but then my grandfather had a brother named John Hibbs, John Q. Hibbs, and the reason that John Quincy Hibbs, I'm sure he was a Republican or they wouldn't have named him that. Then he had another son named Wessie Hibbs, who was Venus Blosser's father, and he died very young. And then my grandfather had a sister, Grace, and she died young.
There would be 3 boys and 1 girl.
3 boys and 1 girl, as I recall it, that was it. Then there was other relatives, such as my great-grandfather's had a brother that was Amos Hibbs, and he was a father to Pauline Evans's mother. Several of those people,
Right?
they were all distant relatives.
Yes.
And so the Hibbs family has been here many, many years.
Yes.
There's been someone here ever since 1887.
That's a long time.
Yes. Then as time rolled around, why, my grandfather was married to Mattie Kyle. Her people come here in 1886 and landed on the creek right.
That's your grandfather.
Yeah.
You didn't give me your grandmother's first name.
My grandmother, Mattie.
Or great-grandmother.
Oh, Grace. No, wait a minute. Excuse me. Emily. Emily was her name.
Emily.
Wesley was his name.
Wesley.
That was my great-grandfather and grandmother.
You're talking now about your grandfather.
I'm talking about my grandfather who married my grandmother.
Yes, your grandfather. This is grandfather.
Grandfather Ed Hibbs.
Ed Hibbs. Okay. Well, that was the sheriff.
Yes.
Okay.
And he married Mattie Kyle.
And Mattie Kyle.
And her people came here in 1886.
Well, they were here before your...
Yes. 1 year before my...
I didn't know the Kyles had been here that long.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Then my grandfather and grandmother had 3 boys and 2 girls. My father was the oldest boy. Herbert R. Hibbs was his name.
They had how many boys?
3.
3 and 1 girl.
2 girls.
2 girls. Okay.
And Herbert R. Hibbs was my father.
Okay.
My mother.
Herbert.
Right.
And your mother?
Taney, T-A-N-I-E. Her maiden name was Taney Hunt. Her people came here in 1902.
Okay, and when were they married?
In 1911.
1911. Okay. Now then, let's go back to your grandfather now.
All right.
And he lived out here on the place that your great-grandfather had lived on?
Yes, that's right.
And what did he do? Just farm, or was he...
My grandfather?
Your grandfather.
Well, they run cattle. He and a fellow named Johnny Sims run cattle together.
Yes, I want you to tell me about that.
They had in those days, there's no fences. They had what they called a drift fence, so cattle wouldn't go clear to the Canadian River.
Yes.
And that was located on the Oklahoma, Texas line, south of Beaver here, about 20 miles. I don't know what year that they did this together, but my father was very young, I know, when they had these roundups.
Yeah.
And by the way, I was named after Johnny Sims's son, was Pascal Sims, and he and my father was great friends, and that's where I got the name of Pascal.
Where did the Sims live?
They lived on right north of Derzetta, just over into Oklahoma, about a mile.
I know where they live, but I wanted it on here, you see.
Yeah, it's right straight east of Old Capitol Hill, about 2 or 3 miles.
What they used to call the Sims Ranch.
Sims Ranch, that's where they lived.
Yes.
And my folks lived out here on Clear Creek, so they run cattle all from here to there.
Yes.
So they had a big spread.
Did you ever take part in any of the roundups?
No, I wasn't even born when this was all taking place.
No.
So my dad did when he was a young man.
Well, could you tell me, can you describe what a roundup is?
Oh, definitely.
Okay, let's...
I've been on a few, but not with them.
Uh-huh.
That's where a group of people, cowboys, get together. They have a chuck wagon, some way to feed the hands, and a cook, and a helper, cook's helper. They have a certain place to meet to bring their cattle to this gathering point. And there may be 25 or 30 different people on those cattle that's in that group.
Yeah.
Well, as you get them gathered, each man will go in and they pick out their own cattle because they're identified by brands, earmarks and brands and so forth. He'll gather his up and take them home and so forth. That's the way they separate them. They didn't have any fences to hold them. They all run free range.
What was a maverick?
A maverick was a stray animal that was not branded. Really couldn't be claimed by no one in reality. It may have strayed in there for miles and miles. It might have been missed as a baby calf, unbranded, unclaimed. And I don't know what they did with those. I think they butchered them and fed the crew, I think is the way they did it. But I know my dad, when he was very young, 10, 12, 13 years old, why, they would go as far west as Perryton, Texas. That is, do know what the Perryton, Texas.
Yes.
And from there east toward Supply. I mean, just, you know, miles and miles. They covered.
Yes.
They'd be gone for days. One deal I recall that my grandfather told me. They were on a roundup. They were southwest of Beaver, some 20 mile, 25 maybe. And he and a cousin of his, which was Uncle Amos's son, his name was Perry Hibbs. He never was married, but if there was a cowboy, he was a cowboy. That's all he knew. He could ride them, he could rope them. They were bringing a bunch of cattle from the Blue Mound community, if you know where that might be.
Yes.
And as they were coming back, and they went to turn some cattle, and Perry's horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and broke his leg. There they were. 2 men, 2 saddles, 1 horse. Long ways from camp. Just a little ways before this all happened, they run across a group of Mustangs. That's horses that's unclaimed also. So Perry said, well, Ed, if you'll let me have your horse, I'll put my saddle on your horse, and I'll go get me a horse. Be back in a little bit. So that's what he did. And he roped a little bay stallion, Mustang. Granddad said it's the most beautiful horse you ever seen.
Is that what you call the wild?
That's what you call the wild horses, Mustangs. But he got him back. They eared him down and got the saddles changed, and he said the last thing Perry said, turn him loose and I'll see you in camp. So he said the last time I seen him, he's a bucking, headed for camp, which was near Elwood. He said when I got in, he said I had quite a time bringing cattle, you know, keeping them gathered. Horses played out and he's played out, but anyway, he got them in. When he got there, the horse was in a rock kraal, and by the way, that rock kraal still stands on that creek out there where I was born. But that horse was in this rock kraal, and Perry was in the house. So, but the horse wouldn't eat, so they finally had to turn him loose.
Well.
Go back. He just broke his spirit and he wouldn't eat. So that's some of the tough things that happened in those days.
Yes.
And it was the people that settled this country back in late 1880s and 90s, close to 1900. They had a lot of hard times, as you well know.
But they enjoyed it.
Oh yes, that's all they knew.
Well, they liked that kind of life.
Getting back to my grandmother, Kyle, grandmother Hibbs, there was a Kyle. They had, my father had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and they're all gone now. And but anyway, I have a lot of cousins and so forth, and scattered around. And then there was 3 or 4 of us kids, Herbert and Taney Hibbs. I'm the eldest. I had 2 sisters and 1 brother. My brother Leroy Hibbs that lives here. He has a family. I lost my wife in December the 12th, 1983.
Let's get back before we go into your family. Could you name some of the early day ranchers here?
Oh yes.
And could you tell me where they're located, approximately?
Well, of course, the ones that I was most familiar with was the Sims Ranch.
Yes.
Now we're talking about people that did nothing but run cattle.
But run cattle.
And then there was the Maples here on the river.
On Beaver River.
On the Beaver River. And the Barbies. And the Tainters. And the Tainter Ranch was over here close to Knowles.
Yes.
And then there was the McFarland Ranch, which is right here.
Where is it located?
The McFarland Ranch?
Yes, I never did know.
Would be where Mr. Robert McFarland first landed in this country in the 1880s. I don't know just what year. But it would be approximately a mile north of the town of Beaver and approximately 2 miles west, or 3
Out
maybe.
in there.
Yeah, right on the river. And he kept buying land and so forth.
Was that Bob's
That's
father?
Bob's father. That's right. And then the John George Ranch was due west of that, which was close to Florence, Oklahoma. And then the Donaldson Ranch was up the river. I knew Mr. George. I knew Mr. Donaldson very well. And as you go on west, in those days we didn't go very far on horseback.
That's
so
right. So
just with your neighbors, and
that's right.
that's all you knew.
Well, who was west of Beaver then? Just due west of Beaver.
Due west? Well, you take the John George Ranch and the Donaldson Ranch, and then the Greggs came in out there, but they didn't do much ranching. They did more farming. And I really can't. Harry Curtin was out there. They run a lot of cattle. George and Harry Curtin.
In the 1880s?
No, Mr. Curtin probably did in close to 1900. George wasn't that old.
I see.
I just can't recall right offhand. I should have made some.
Well, I think you've done well to remember the ones you have. Well, that is really interesting, and I'm glad to get that on record, permanent record. Can you tell me what kind of house did your parents live in? Were they?
Yes, I was born in a sod house, and that's all I had. Was a sod house, and people lived in dugouts, built back in the bank with dirt on the roof, made mostly of cottonwood limbs, leaves, what have you, covered with dirt.
Did they build this right on the ground, on the level ground, the roof, or how did they do that?
They built it back in the bank mostly, and then used poles over it and had that covered, and then they plastered the walls with cleachy, what we call cleachy today, gyp. So they plastered that like you would plaster the walls.
Well, they didn't have any windows in it then?
No, not in the dugouts, they didn't. They couldn't have bought them anyway. They wouldn't have the money. But the sod houses now had windows.
Yes.
And where I was born, there was a sod house. And the roof was made with sod. I mean, sod was cut and put there. And then they grew cactus. They planted cactus on those roofs to help keep the rain from washing the dirt off and keep the roots there. And if they get a good season, well, a lot of times that'd grow and be green and so forth.
You mean those flat leaf cactuses that
yes,
we have in
yes,
the pasture?
Them old sticky cactuses
yes.
hurt you when that's what.
Well, that's the first time I've heard that.
Yes,
but I'm glad to know that.
Then their cellars was made the same way. They'd put cactus on there, and that'd keep the kids from laying on the roof and falling through.
Well, now, in doing research, I remember hearing about it came a big rain and this roof fell in and killed a woman and a baby that was in bed. Do you know anything about that?
No, I don't.
You don't remember hearing that?
No, I don't.
Well, back in 1970, I remember somebody was telling something about that. What kind of winters did they have?
The winter that I was born, in the winter of 11 and 12, which is a very noted winter, they said it was terrible. Of course, I don't remember it naturally, but when, since I was born in February of 12, they had no doctors. They used what they call midwives, as you well know. And there was my father was and another guy was taking care of a bunch of sheep out here on the creek, and that winter they would come in there with around 4,000 sheep, and left with probably 400. They suffocated in the storms, and there was nothing nobody could do about it.
Yes.
But anyway, this fellow took a team and a sled and went 2 or 3 miles and got a woman or two to come and help my mother with when I was delivered. So that's the kind of deals they had, and what little fences they had around to hold their stock in, they just drove a team right over those fences and pulled those sleds, and to get feed and try to get down to get groceries and some coal and what have you to live. But I remember so many talking about the winter 11 and 12. I don't know, it must have been terrible.
That's the way with me. I remember hearing them talk about it. I don't remember it myself, but I remember them talking about it. Now, there was one time in doing this research, and your great-grandfather might have been in that, where there was such a snowstorm. I believe it was in 1887 or 88 or 89, where so many cattle froze. Can you tell me something about that?
All I know about that is that I believe it was in 1889, as I recall now.
It seems to me like
These
that.
cattle hit this drift fence we were talking about, south of Beaver, between Beaver and Booker. And they said you could walk for miles on skeletons of cattle where they get it up against this fence and suffocated and died right there. And you could just walk for miles and miles on bones, and could for several years. Then they began to pick these bones up and haul them out to the city and sell the bones. I don't know what all they used it for. They made fertilizer or something.
I think.
And but they skinned cattle and sold the skins as soon as the weather broke for livelihood. And so.
What did they get for bones in those
I
days?
don't have no idea.
Nor
If I was ever told, I don't recall.
I don't recall how much they brought either. But anyway, that brought in money for the pioneers to
buy a few clothes for the children and their families, and get a little coal, stable stuff like sugar and coffee.
Have you ever gathered cow chips?
Definitely.
I
and not just to show. I never was around cedars too much, but they had a long platform. You take this stalks of this broom corn that house brooms is made out of, put it on this table, and they butted this again the table to keep it straight. They'd run this brush through a deal that had a bunch of fingers on it and knocked all the seed off of it. And then that went on and hot-footed to a guy that's up in the baler, and they'd hand pack it in this baler, and then they'd take a team and press it real tight and put wires around it and kick it out, and those bales weighed about 300 pounds.
Well, how would they put a team on it?
Well, they used a team that used a compressor that pressed this. They pressed it together, and
that team went around the baler.
Around the baler, and pressed this stuff, kept it good and tight, and then they would put the wires around it and open it up and kick that one out and start another bale.
Yes, and that was a dirty, dirty job.
And very itchy.
Yes.
Very itchy.
Yes. Okay, your father used horses or mules?
Both.
Both. Which did you like the better to work?
Well, naturally, I liked horses better.
You liked the horses?
But
mules are kind of contrary.
Well, yes, but we had some good mules. We had some good horses.
And, of course, when he first came here, they had what kind of plow? Sod.
Well, sod plow.
And then...
Just an old turning plow, and then a lister.
A lister, and then what?
Well, and then a little disc. The monitor, they called it, to cultivate their crops with, to weed it. Knife sleds.
Yes.
That's what
and
we
then
used.
To progress on up further, what was next?
Well, then you begin to get into the tractor age,
Yes.
which they used what they call one-ways, turning plows, and so forth. Farming is far different today in 1984 than it was when I first helped my daddy in 1918, I'll tell you for sure.
Well, let's see, what are the late model
Tractors?
tractors? And
I believe the latest, or the most popular one in this area at the present time is the John Deere. I see more of them, at least.
Yes.
I'm not selling John Deere's, and I'm not talking for them, but that seems to be the main one. And there's Case, Oliver, and
what kind of plows do they use now?
Oh, really, Berenice, I haven't farmed in several years, and so I'm not too familiar with farming.
You work with farmers.
Yeah, I've worked with farmers, and I have farmed, but it's a far cry. When I quit farming in about 1955.
Oh, you did?
And so I'm not too familiar with what they use.
Now then, you told me the other night that you quit school. You didn't graduate.
That's right.
You finished the junior year.
Yes.
11th grade.
11th grade. Mm-hmm.
Did you leave from choice, or did you feel like you had to?
Well, I had to. My father was sick, and we had to eat,
Mm-hmm.
I was the oldest child.
Mm-hmm.
So I quit school and went to work and helped feed the family, and he was laid up for quite a long while, and so then when he did get back to where he could function all right, I had lost my arrow in my class, had no more. I didn't want to go then, naturally. Besides that, I'd met my sweetheart and married her a little later, and consequently I didn't want to go back to school.
All right, and who was she? What was her name?
Lorella Gertrude Smith. She was born and raised near Gray, Oklahoma. We met at Balco, Oklahoma, at a church social.
At a church social.
And
you just saw her across the room and you knew she was the one.
Well, so to speak.
And when were you married?
August 26, 1929. I was real old. I was 17 and a half years old, but I thought I was a grown man. We have 2 children. Our son, Leon, he married Maxine Parker, and her people was pioneers here also.
Is she kin to these Parkers?
She is, yes. Her family lived just across the section from where I was born, where my dad was born.
Oh, right in that neighborhood.
Yeah, it was all right there by the Elwood schoolhouse. And they have 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. They live at Durant. He's president of the college there, Southeastern State University, and has been since July 1967.
Oh, that's
doing
nice.
real well. His oldest son is in the computer business. He has 2 computer stores that he owns himself.
Well.
His oldest daughter, she's a school teacher. She's married and has a little boy, 4 years old. They live at Denison, Texas. Her husband works for Texas Instruments. They're doing real well.
That's good.
Then his second boy, he's 23 years old, born 61. He has a feed store business, and he trades. He does has a yard business down there. He hires a bunch of people, and they go around, and he doesn't do it, but he sees it done. They mow yards, they replant flower beds. They do this for elderly people that can't do it. And he's got a good business going and doing real well with it.
That's great.
And his youngest daughter, she's 16, will be 16 in December, and so of course she's getting a little boy crazy, I suppose, like all the rest of us at that age.
Well, she's probably in high school, senior in high school.
Yes, she is.
And your daughter?
My daughter is married and has 2 children. And they live at Norman, Oklahoma, and she's a nurse, and her husband's a barber. She married Charles Nicholson. They have 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy, he lays carpet, helps his father, and so forth. And their daughter's still in school.
Where did you and Your wife's name is
Lou.
Lou. Where did she live? Where do you live? Where did you live when you?
Where did we live? We lived at Balco.
At Balco? What did you do there?
I worked for the county, run a road grader and tractor, cat tractor.
I didn't know you ever lived at Balco.
Oh yes, for years.
Well, and then what happened? You came to Beaver, or
Well, we farmed out there.
Oh,
We
you
finally got a hold of a little land and rented, and like everybody else had to start out, and kept gathering up some calves and growing them into milk cows and so forth. And then in 1942, we moved to Beaver, and I went into business up here, had the mobile oil business, and later on, I was elected county commissioner here in 1948.
Well, didn't you run a drugstore?
Yes, I had a drugstore.
I remember being in that store.
Yes, we had a drugstore, and I bought into the sale barn with the Barbies, Lloyd and Otto Barbie, and I pretty well had my hands full.
Well, I think
and
so.
But anyway, it all worked out real well for us.
That's good.
Later on, I sold the store, and we bought into the sale down here, Lloyd and Otto and I, and sold the store because it was getting too hard on my wife, being on her feet so much. It was a good business, a good clean business. But then I chose not to seek re-election, and so Arlen
How
Harris,
long were you commissioner?
24 years.
That's what I was thinking.
And then I decided I wasn't going to run anymore, and they thought I ought to, but I didn't think I ought to. So I went to work for the Bank of Beaver. I was a PR person for the Bank of Beaver for
Yes.
6.5 years.
I remember that.
I enjoyed that very much. I learned a lot.
Yes.
I have no education as far as books are concerned, but I've got a heck of a lot of knowledge from different things I did, you know. People I've worked with that did know,
Yes.
like the banking business. I learned a lot in that. I'm no banker, but I still learned a lot.
And that helped you in taking
Yes.
care of your finances.
That's right. Very much, very much.
When did you sell out on the sale ring?
In 81, 3 years ago,
Well, first, didn't you buy the Barbies out?
bought one of them out. Lloyd and I bought Otto out.
Oh.
Lloyd and I had it till we sold it.
Oh, I see.
But my wife's health got bad, and I just need to spend more time with her, and so I chose to sell it. And so that's what we did.
Well,
I still help them there one day a week.
yes. Well, that gives you something to do.
Yes, I have.
And you're still in the cattle business, too, when you're out there.
So to speak, yes. Don't own any cattle, but I'm still in the business.
Yes. I remember telling you one time, when we were selling these books, you know, the Beaver County history books that I worked on, I told you that when we got them all sold, there'd be $1 million go through our hands. And I asked you what other business in town would produce $1 million, and you told me, you remember what you told me?
Probably the Beaver Livestock Sale.
Yes.
Very true.
Every Wednesday you said there'd be $1 million go through your hands.
Lots of times. Yeah, a lot of times.
But I was shocked. I figured maybe 500,000.
Yeah.
You know, I had it.
Yeah, but stop to think now. When you sell $500,000 worth, you've handled $1 million worth, because you pay these people for it and you collect that. So you've handled $1 million.
Yes.
If you sold $500,000 worth of cattle, you've handled $1 million.
What was your biggest day run down there? Do you remember?
In head count, around 3,000.
3,000. Every Wednesday or about?
Well, not every Wednesday, but we've had around 3,000.
You enjoyed that work?
Very much,
in
very
the
much.
sale.
Very much.
What's your future plans?
Well, I'm retired or retarded, whichever the case might be. I really don't have any plans. I'm just living for myself and my kids, and enjoy being with them as much as I can.
Yes.
Enjoy my friends and If I didn't have any friends and neighbors,
Life wouldn't be
it
lived.
wouldn't be worth living.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, you've got a lot of friends.
Thank you. I hope so.
I know you
So
have.
do you. Because I'm one of them.
Well, thank you. Let's see, there was something I wanted to ask you. Now I can't think what it was. That isn't a sign I'm getting old, is it?
No way.
Well, can you think of anything else that...
Well, all I can think of that Laurel and I lived together for a little over 54 years, and she died with a heart attack or stroke. Dr. Kellyan says a stroke. I don't know, but I know it's been awful lonesome.
Mm-hmm. We celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary a few years ago, and last March we celebrated our 54th anniversary.
Yeah, that's, lots and lots of people never make it to 50, let alone 54.
That's right.
So we have a lot of things we think
Oh, don't we, though?
our children, our grandchildren,
Mm-hmm.
leave a lot of happy memories.
Sounds like that you have really lived a full, rich life,
Well, I've tried to.
and I think you've been happy on the way.
I've tried to live like I'd like to be treated, treat you like I like to be treated,
Mm-hmm.
and I believe as long as you do that, you're living pretty well to the Golden Book, aren't you?
I think so.
I've always believed in one true and living God, and I always will.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying I'm real religious, but I'm sure not the old devil either. So
Now you sound like Pat. Okay, if there isn't anything now that we can think of.
well, I would like to say this, Berenice, that
Okay.
I've enjoyed you and your work with the history. I've always kidded you about being the Hysterical Society.
Yes, I
And
know.
you asked me why, and I said, because you're always hysterical when you come and want something. I always tried to help you, and I've enjoyed it, and enjoyed your husband very much, and I was down there when you had your sale, and I know that hurt very
Oh,
badly,
yes.
and I felt for you, but you did the right thing, and I wish you and your husband very many happy years yet to go.
Thank you. I couldn't have done what I did if he hadn't approved.
Oh, Bryce Jackson is one of the greatest fellows I ever met.
He just, he knew I loved that kind of
yeah.
word, and he really stood behind me.
He really has, and you can be thankful for Bryce Jackson.
Yes.
Sure can.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Pat.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.